1998. Pokemon Red and Blue, as well as the accompanying anime, have hit North America and hit it hard. Pokemania is in full effect, launching the juggernaut that we all know went on to become the planet's most successful and lucrative Ultra franchise. Sorry, Disney. Who could have guessed that collecting dozens of zany little creatures in the wilderness would be the ultimate recipe to capture the attention of gamers and of mass culture? The obvious answer would be Satoshi Tajiri and Game Freak, but I'm not so sure this is the best answer. See, in Japan, there's another RPG franchise that carries this sort of mythical status cultural impact. In 1986, Enix's Yuji Horii directed what became the defining early JRPG, Dragon Quest. The franchise is, to this day, so popular in Japan that Square Enix will only release new games on weekends. Otherwise, the economy literally might crash because of people calling in sick to work. And 1992's Dragon Quest V introduced a new mechanic to the series, recruiting wild monsters to fight with your team, beating Pokemon to the punch by 4 full years. And I've never heard of Shin Megami Tensei. Don't talk to me about that. This video is about Dragon Quest monsters. Dragon Quest monsters. So in 1998, as Pokemania was on a meteoric, unstoppable rise, Horii directed Dragon Quest Monsters, a spin-off dedicated to just creature collecting, at a time when tons of developers were trying to cash in on the fad with their version of Flumbomon or whatever. One of the real OGs came back to either do exactly the same thing or assert dominance and show the world what real monster taming looks like. So it kind of both is and isn't a Pokemon ripoff. And I gotta be honest with you, against all odds, Dragon Quest Monsters might just be the single best game on the original Game Boy, and it kicks Pokemon Red and Blue's teeth right in. Dragon Quest Monsters, right. The DQ series was originally called Dragon Warrior internationally, but Square Enix realized that the real reason Final Fantasy was more popular overseas was that they brought chaos upon the world when they renumbered all of the games for the release of Final Fantasy VII. So in 2005, they tried to make lightning strike twice and just rebranded Dragon Warrior as Dragon Quest everywhere to match Japan. But we're just going to use the DQ name because it is the truth and also a couple syllables shorter. Dragon Quest Monsters is a pretty simple game in most respects. It follows a young Terry, who is a character from Dragon Quest VI, trying to rescue his sister after she is kidnapped by a monster. You find yourself also whisked away to the whimsical kingdom of Great Tree, where the king enlists you to be a monster tamer to represent his land in the upcoming Starry Night tournament. Terry accepts this challenge, with the promise that victory will help him reunite with his sister. But this is definitely a game that just needed some story, not a story that needed a venue so that it could be told. We're here for those juicy RPG mechanics and the very goofy tone and presentation of this little gem. Great Tree itself is pretty small, but it grows over the course of the game, literally, and lots of the NPCs have fun little character arcs. I like this guy who's obsessed with his hot GF. Eventually you end up finding out she's a monster in disguise, and you fight her, and then the dude has an existential crisis about it. You know what they say, these foes ain't loyal. It's silly and weird, and I love it. But unlike most typical RPGs, exploration really is not a core focus of this game. Instead of having a sprawling, continuous world you slowly hack your way through, Great Tree is a small hub area that contains dozens of traveler's gates, or portals to self-contained dungeons. Each dungeon is a series of randomly generated floors, as few as 4 or as many as 30, and on each level your simple goal is to find the, again, randomly located hole to the next floor. Is just like sports ball? There's not much to these dungeons other than picking up some treasure on the ground, running into an enemy monster tamer to fight here and there, and, of course, random encounters. And while this may sound vapid, perhaps boring, it is thankfully backed by the greatest composition on the Game Boy, Never Ending Journey. This track is so wistful, emotional, and pensive that it completely carries these quests that are, admittedly, not dripping with personality otherwise. This song literally accounts for so much of my affection toward this game. It is perfect. There are deeper reasons that I think this approach to dungeon design may actually secretly be genius. I'll get to that in a minute, but first let's talk about the actual Dragon Quest monsters.
He said the thing!
You have a chance of recruiting monsters just by defeating them in combat, but you can raise those odds by feeding them meat during the fight. And yet not a word from PETA. Curious. One of the coolest things about DQM compared to Pokemon is that when you run into enemy monster masters, you can actually steal their creatures if you throw enough snack at them. And a lot of the coolest and most important monsters can only be caught this way, especially in the early game. You can bring 3 monsters with you in your party, and the combat is super traditional JRPG style. You can attack, defend, use items, or use magic skills at the cost of MP. One neat quirk this game has, though, is that in important tournament fights, you can't issue direct orders of what to do, instead having to choose between charge, for pure blistering offense, mixed, for sort of a mixed role between offense and support, and cautious, for your healer, basically, or someone in immense danger. It's a neat twist that makes your critters feel a little bit more real, and I find it to be interesting enough to outweigh the occasional associated frustration where they just never use the right move and target the wrong enemies. But the real meat of this game isn't just in catching the monsters in front of you and fighting with those. It's in using them to breed new ones. And this meat is a delicious sirloin, not some tasteless beef jerky. When 2 monsters create an offspring, they pass on some of the stats they've earned as well as every skill they currently have learned, plus additional perks based on some more complex dimensions like resistances and amount of breeding in a chain. This means that if you're willing to put a little bit of a grind in, you can create a team of figurative gods very early in the game. And then later on, actual gods, probably. I actually don't know my Dragon Quest lore that well. Like, look at this team I was using about halfway through the game. We got a divine dragon, a literal golden Giga Chad, and this idiot. The nearly unmatched freedom of customization through the whole breeding process means that even this doofus can hold her own with the big boys, with proper planning. And that she too will eventually be a building block for another deity. If, like me, the appeal of JRPGs to you is the eventual feeling of becoming a being so disgustingly powerful that you could erase the material realm from its misfortunate plane of existence with a mere thought, you might just like this game as much as I do. This makes it pretty easy and frankly encouraged to get lost in the grind of building up cool monsters. I was late to Thanksgiving dinner because I just really wanted to make it to Vinnigan. Sorry, Mom. Also, I will never call it Divine Gone because it isn't portrayed by Liam Neeson. In order to breed a pair of creatures, they have to be of different genders and at least level 10, which means you'll be making lots of quick runs back into Traveler's Gates to hit that benchmark for every step toward your ultimate beast. Sometimes you also need to rebreed the same monster so that you could give it a new gender, which the game actually calls blessing. Dragon Quest been woke. This adds additional links in your chain of monster procreation, which means even more grinding, but also a stronger end result. So this is why the random dungeons actually end up being kind of a good idea. As you re-explore places you've already been, it isn't a simple, brainless waste of time retread. There's new geography and freshly spawning treasure all the time, and you can find really useful things like the fanciest meats pretty early on in the game. So the push toward this kind of grind actually ends up helping build your inventory and gold supply, which leads to your power level growing exponentially before you know it. Of course, this means that playing the game on hardware without a speed up function can be a little brutal, but thankfully we find ways. And there are other seemingly annoying game design choices, like the fact that you can't have more than 40 monsters at any given time, or that the beasts grow wild while they're sitting at the farm outside your party and stop listening to your instructions in battle. But all of these pieces actually function to push the player toward churning through their monsters early and often by constantly breeding. This is the best way to grow stronger and breeze through the game, and it's kind of brilliant to force you into it instead of just suggesting breeding as the best path. I honestly would probably ignore that advice and try to catch them all, as they say. But instead, Enix left literally no option for my hoarding tendencies. Anyone who's been here since my Fire Emblem Heroes days knows that I will hold on to any resource into infinity just in case a better way to use it might come along. But the design choices in DQM inspire me to immediately figure out what new hellbeast I can put together using a rare monster or boss recruitment, instead of sequestering it permanently in the farm, waiting for some perfect option, or just keeping the rare thing for my collection. And this makes the game addictive and fulfilling in a way that I am so glad that no gacha game developer has tapped into, because I get completely swept up in Dragon Quest Monsters whenever I replay it. It feels so good to finally get the monster you've been chasing. And I think that's why I prefer this to the early Pokemon games. It's much more engrossing, even if it doesn't have the same kind of cohesive world or personal narrative attached to it that even the oldest Pokemon games do. DQM does a fantastic job of pulling you deeper into its silly little world by teasing you with its weird cast of creatures and the promise of unbelievable power. The strongest things you can breed in this game make Mewtwo look like a joke. Actually, another reason DQM sticks in my brain in a special way is that it does have a cool post-game, which I think Pokemon Red and Blue kinda lack. There's a suite of secret dungeons where you face off against final bosses from proper Dragon Quest games, which is a super neat touch and also gives DQM a satisfying difficulty spike to make all that breeding and grinding feel worth it. And Pokemon itself was far from fully realized with the original games. Think about the weird glitches and design choices and the ugly sprites. There's just no reason not to play newer Pokemon games instead. Whereas the Dragon Quest Monsters series is much smaller by comparison, and most of the titles never left Japan. There's a direct sequel to this game that just isn't quite as dear to my heart, and then the DQM Joker series on the DS, which I've never played because I'm a fake fan. So the original has real lasting appeal. It's not hard to see why Dragon Quest Monsters never made the same cultural impact as Pokemon, but for my time and money, this is a way more captivating and deep single-player experience on the Game Boy, and it'll always be one of the most nostalgic games of all time for me. Now, I can't fully recommend going back and playing the original DQM today. There are some archaic game design choices at its core that might not be forgivable without those fond memories, which I think is also true of the original Pokemon. But I hope I've given you an idea of just what made this game so special in its time. And there is good news. Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince just came out, and it's the first game in the series released outside Japan in quite a while. I'm in no way affiliated with Square Enix, but I'm a little excited about this one, so let me know down below if you'd like to see a video about that. And throw some meat at the subscribe button while you're down there. Also, where is that Dragon Quest III remake I've been waiting for? I guess it's just too beautiful for this world, but at least we've got DQM. Anyway, thanks for hanging out. Till then.